By the late 1990s, a small group of men in the mountains of Afghanistan had sketched a terrifyingly simple idea: use commercial airliners as instruments of attack. The operatives who would carry that plan into the world came from different countries. But the kernel of the idea was one: strike the symbols of American economic and military power. In the months and years before September 2001, men like Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, Hani Hanjour, and Ziad Jarrah moved into classrooms and flight simulators in the West. They learned to pay, to book, to blend. They were trained in places the public has come to know: Afghan camps, European cells, and they traveled quietly to the United States. But plots do not grow in isolation. They require money, movement, and mundane facilitation. That is where a different cast of characters enters: the unremarkable middlemen, the porters, the travel clerks, the petty smugglers, and a handful of shadowy fixers who prefer the anonymity of small transactions to the notice of authorities. In the summer of 2001, Basra's docks swelled with freighters. Karim al-Masri, a 32-year-old supervisor at a modest shipping yard, liked the slow honesty of his work: manifests, forklifts, lunches in the shade, until a new client started steering odd crates into the far corner. The crates were ordinary enough: second-hand engines, coils of wire, boxes labeled samples. Karim didn't like the way the man paid in bundles of banknotes, or the way he never gave a full name. The man who hired the crate handlers called himself Hussein Nabil. He wore a business shirt and had a knack for plausible explanations. Hussein told Karim he worked for a trading concern moving goods to North Africa. He tipped generously. When Karim's foreman asked questions, Hussein smiled and said it was all above board. In Baghdad, in a narrow lane behind a bakery, a small office advertised visas and travel. Fast cash accepted. The proprietor, Amal Zaiden, had emigrated years earlier and returned with a modest savings. She booked dozens of legal tickets every week for construction workers and families emigrating to Europe and the Gulf. Once in a while, a customer would pay in envelopes with no return address and ask for last-minute itineraries that avoided paper trails. Amal took the money. She later told investigators, "I thought it was a favor. I didn't ask." Across the region, from Basra's warehouses to Baghdad's travel desks, a pattern emerged: small flows of cash, last-minute tickets, and a dozen transactions that could be framed as ordinary commerce. Nothing was dramatic by itself. The drama was in the aggregate. If a plot requires money, it needs discreet channels. In the port cafes outside Manama and the cramped corridors of money exchange shops in the old souks and formal transfer systems, centuries old and used legitimately by millions, provided an attractive opacity. Our story does not name or finger any state actor. Instead, it follows the fictional people who use these systems for their own ends. Meet Yusuf al-Rami, a bookseller in a coastal emirate who doubled as a courier for cash envelopes. Yusuf never handled large sums, $10,000 here, $5,000 there, but he knew how to move value across borders without the trace a bank record might show. He delivered envelopes to numbered P.O. boxes and nodded at cabs that would shuttle packages to other couriers. "You can send love letters, you can send a ticket," he would say. People pay for trust. Near the docks in an unnamed Gulf port, a container manifest lists textiles and machine parts. But inside, investigators would later find only ordinary goods and a single crate of flight manuals and old navigation charts. Items legal to buy and sell, mundane in themselves, but valuable to someone learning the contours of the skies. The manifests were genuine. The difference between innocent shipment and helpful shipment was a human decision at one of many nodes. Crucially, in every port and money exchange desk, there were plausible deniabilities. Couriers used aliases, payments were in cash, receipts were thin. It is easy in narration to suggest grand conspiracies. The quieter truth is that large plots often exploit everyday frictions and the loopholes of routine commerce. In a shabby guest house above a bakery in a Mediterranean port, two men practiced reciting airline safety procedures aloud. They were quiet, polite. They left small tips and paid in cash. The landlady, a widowed seamstress named Muna, later said she remembered only uniforms drying, the smell of coffee and books strewn across the table. She did not remember the passports that would be photographed by investigators months later. In the suburbs of a European city, a cafe, a photocopy shop, a rented two-bedroom apartment, another thread took shape. A small band of middlemen kept correspondence. They traded addresses, phoned in the early hours, and booked rendezvous at transit hubs. One of them, Basim al-Rashid, had a past as a small-time smuggler. He had once ferried textiles and household goods between ports. When the money came, he took jobs that required only discretion. These safe houses and training rooms were not military compounds. They were ordinary spaces where ordinary things, timetables, flight manuals, charts, collected and were used. They were also the sort of places that investigators often reach only after the event, scavenging for traces amid dust and mismatched furniture. In a seaside town across the Mediterranean, a young man named Ibrahim Hadi Khalil ran errands for a small NGO that repaired schools. He loved the sea and the way the town smelled like citrus. He also had cousins who worked in shipping lines. When a man with a briefcase asked for a favor, a passenger list altered by a day, a duplicate boarding pass delivered quietly, Ibrahim did not think he was doing harm. "We were small cogs," he told a local reporter years later. "We had no idea of the engine." In Beirut, a fixer known only as Rami prided himself on being the kind of person who could get an answer. He arranged accommodations and bought bus tickets. Once, he registered a dozen prepaid SIM cards for clients who wanted privacy. In another life, he might have been a private investigator. In this one, he was a subcontractor. These were all planned in preparation for the deal day. It was Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. In New York City, the sky was cloudless, a brilliant late summer morning. Commuters poured into Manhattan. Traders rushed to Wall Street. Parents kissed their children goodbye before heading to offices scattered throughout Lower Manhattan. For thousands of workers in the World Trade Center's Twin Towers, gleaming 110-story skyscrapers that define the New York skyline, it was business as usual. No one imagined that within hours, those towers would collapse in fire and ash, killing nearly 3,000 people and changing the world forever. The roots of the attack stretched back nearly a decade. The mastermind was OSAMA bin Laden, leader of the terrorist group al-Qaeda, who had long harbored a hatred for the United States. After the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which killed 6 people, bin Laden vowed that the towers would one day fall completely. By 1996, bin Laden had declared war on America. His deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, shared his vision. Together, they recruited a small group of operatives here and there who were educated, fluent in English, and capable of blending into Western society. They were trained and given strict instructions on how to go about the plan process. The plan was codenamed the Plains Operation. It was conceived by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, a Kuwaiti-born militant and al-Qaeda's chief strategist. KSM suggested hijacking multiple commercial airliners and using them as missiles to attack symbolic American targets. Bin Laden approved the plan/report of all that has been put in place in 1999. Over the next 2 years, real strategists/operatives were chosen, trained in Afghan camps, and quietly sent to the U.S. Among them were Mohammad Atta, an Egyptian architecture student turned extremist who would become the ringleader; Marwan al-Shehi from UAE, who would pilot United Airlines Flight 175; Hani Hanjour, a Saudi national trained in flying schools, who would take control of American Airlines Flight 77; Ziad Jarrah, a Lebanese recruit who would lead United Airlines Flight 93. They were supported by a network of muscle hijackers, mostly young Saudis, Iraqis trained to overpower passengers and crew. The operatives lived quietly in places like Florida, New Jersey, and Hamburg, Germany, Iraq, posing as students or tourists while taking flight lessons. Atta, meticulous and cold, became the central coordinator. He and his men studied airline timetables, tested airport security, and transferred funds through a shadowy network. At dawn on September 11th, the plan was set into motion. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston Logan International Airport at 7:59 a.m. Hijackers Mohammed Atta led 4 others. Target North Tower of the World Trade Center. At 8:46 a.m., the Boeing 767 slammed into the North Tower between floors 93 and 99. Fire and smoke erupted instantly. Hundreds were killed on impact. Thousands above the impact zone were trapped. Just 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston Logan at 8:14 a.m. Hijackers Marwan al-Shaihi and his team. Target South Tower at 9:03 a.m. With millions watching live coverage of the first crash, Flight 175 struck the South Tower between floors 77 and 85. The explosion was broadcast around the world. Panic gripped the nation. This was no accident. America was under attack. Meanwhile, American Airlines Flight 77 departed Washington Dulles at 8:20 a.m. Hijackers Hani Hanjour and 4 accomplices. Target the Pentagon. At 9:37 a.m., the aircraft plowed into the western side of the Pentagon, headquarters of the U.S. military, killing 125 people inside along with the 59 passengers and crew. The final plane, United Airlines Flight 93, departed Newark at 8:42 a.m. Hijackers Ziad Jarrah and team. Target believed to be either the White House or U.S. Capitol. By then, passengers knew through phone calls what had happened in New York. Led by Todd Beamer, who famously said, "Let's roll," they fought back. At 10:03 a.m., the plane crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, thwarting the hijackers' mission but killing everyone on board. Back in New York, tragedy reached its climax. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed after burning for just 56 minutes. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed, burying firefighters, office workers, and rescue teams in a storm of steel, ash, and fire. Lower Manhattan became a war zone. Streets were covered in debris. Survivors staggered through clouds of dust. The skyline of New York had changed forever. In the immediate aftermath, confusion reigned. Air traffic across the U.S. was shut down for the first time in history. Fighter jets scrambled, searching for any other hijacked planes. President George W. Bush, reading to children in a Florida classroom when he learned of the attacks, was rushed aboard Air Force One. By evening, nearly 3,000 people were confirmed dead. Office workers, airline passengers, firefighters, police officers, and first responders. Families searched for loved ones. Posters of the missing filled Manhattan. The world demanded answers. The FBI launched Operation Pent-Bomb, the largest criminal inquiry in U.S. history. Within days, evidence pointed to al-Qaeda. Passenger lists matched known associates of the group. Rental car receipts, flight school records, and financial transactions traced directly back to the hijackers. Investigators uncovered that many of the hijackers had trained at U.S. flight schools, including in Florida and Arizona. Surveillance videos captured them boarding planes calmly. Bank records showed money wired from overseas accounts. By September 18, 2001, the FBI had released photos of all 19 hijackers. Mohammed Atta's face became infamous, the cold eyes of the man who flew the first plane into the North Tower. On September 20, 2001, President Bush declared a war on terror, demanding that Afghanistan's Taliban government hand over bin Laden. When they refused, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom in October, invading Afghanistan and toppling the Taliban. At home, the Department of Homeland Security was created, airport security was overhauled, and the Patriot Act expanded surveillance powers. The 9/11 Commission report, released in 2004, detailed how intelligence failures allowed the plot to succeed, warning that the U.S. was unprepared for such a coordinated assault. The attacks of September 11th were not just an American tragedy. They were a global shockwave. Nearly every nation lost citizens in the towers. It redefined warfare, security, and global politics. The Twin Towers, once symbols of commerce and strength, became symbols of resilience and memory. At Ground Zero, the 9/11 memorial now bears the names of every victim, ensuring their stories live on. But the scars remain. Survivors still battle illness from toxic dust. Families still mourn empty seats at dinner tables. And the haunting images of that day, planes slicing into skyscrapers, towers collapsing into dust, firefighters rushing into flames, remain burned into collective memory. September 11th was more than an attack. It was a moment when the world stood still, a day when hatred claimed thousands of innocent lives, and when heroes were born in the ashes. The story of 9/11 is not just about terror, but also about courage, resilience, and an enduring fight to ensure such a tragedy never happens again.